Welcome to SEXED, the sex ed channel. Today we're going to be talking about trans and cisgenders, so let's start by defining what those terms mean. Trans and cis are prefixes that have been around for a long time. Trans means across, and you've probably heard it used. People use it when they talk about transatlantic flights, meaning flights that go across the Atlantic Ocean, or the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is the railroad that goes across Siberia. Cis is less commonly used in our modern vocabulary, but it just means on the same side of. It's the opposite of trans. Trans has been used to discuss gender for a long time, although what precisely the trans umbrella includes and excludes is a discussion that's evolving over time. Cis has been adopted more recently for discussing gender. It's a practical choice because cis just means the opposite of trans, but it's also a courteous and respectful choice. Prior to cis, people used a wide variety of ways to refer to people who identified as their assigned gender. Assigned meaning the gender your parents gave you based on the genitals you were born with. The thing is, most of the terminology used prior to cis ranged from mildly negative to outright insulting to the trans community. People who use the term natural gender are implying that there's something unnatural about being trans. Similarly, people who use biogender or biological gender are overlooking the very real fact that there might be something biological that causes trans people to identify the way that they do. When it comes right down to it, cis is an appropriate, practical, informative term that isn't pejorative to anyone, and that's what makes it a good term to use. When we talk about the trans community, most people end up using trans as an umbrella term. And what specifically falls under the trans umbrella is up for some debate. It tends to shift a bit depending on who you're talking to. In general, when speaking about a community, it's always good to let the members of the community themselves define who does and does not belong to that community. Of course, like most groups of people, not every single member of the trans community is going to agree about every single little thing. When in doubt, asking for a respectful clarification is always a good way to go. The key word there being respectful. Here are some of the things you might hear spoken of as falling under the trans umbrella. First, we've got people who are transgender. For the record, that means you're not the gender that you were assigned based on your genitals. People get really angry about this, and it's interesting to watch. For one thing, it really underscores how sexist our society is, that people are so invested in having your body define who and what you are. Second, I think if the last episode made anything clear, it's that our genitals really don't tell the whole story. Babies who are born with vulvas are assumed to have uteruses and ovaries and fallopian tubes and breast buds that will develop during puberty, but that's not always true. They're also assumed to have an XX chromosome pattern and the neurological structure of a woman, and that's also not always true. We look at a newborn's genitals and we assume a whole host of things about them, and all those assumptions get bundled up into assigning them a gender. Sometimes we're wrong. All transgender means is that this is one of those times that we were wrong. Cross-dressing is an edge case, and it really depends on how and why you're doing it. Technically, cross-dressing just means wearing the clothes that are associated with the other end of the gender spectrum. It's back to talking about presentation, but a very specific presentation in regard to your gender. Some people cross-dress without any gender implications behind it. There are women who wear zoot suits. There are men who wear skirts. Generally, these people wouldn't fall under the trans umbrella. They're just playing with their appearance. They're not trying to represent something about their identity. Some people cross-dress and have a persona that they put on when they cross-dress. Drag queens and drag kings are a good example of this. They may lead cisgender daily lives, but when they go out in drag, they have a trans persona. Some people in the trans community object to that because they say it implies that trans is something you can choose or not choose, and so they say that drag is not a version of a trans identity. Others in the trans community think that the drag community is just in denial about their own inner nature and that they're scared to come out as trans. Still others in the trans community say it doesn't matter. Let the drag community decide for themselves whether they want to be included in the trans community or not. I'm not trans, So my general rule of thumb is that as an outsider, I don't get to decide who gets a place in the trans community and who doesn't. As an individual, however, I always stick to my own personal rule. If someone tells me they're trans, I accept that. It's not up to me to judge how they choose to live out that reality. Last but not least, some people cross-dress as a very specific stepping stone in the process of changing their presentation to the outside world. If someone is trans, technically you could say that they're not cross-dressing when they first switched presentations. They're really presenting true to their actual gender for the first time. In that case, it would be more accurate to say they were cross-dressing their whole lives up until that point. But the fact remains that a lot of people identify this as a step in transition, often one of the first steps. So in that case, cross-dressing definitely falls under the trans umbrella. Transsexual is a term that's falling out of favor, and some even find it blatantly offensive. For that reason, I advise against you using it, but I wanted to make sure I covered it in case you ever encountered it out in the world. Generally, sex refers to your physical form, whether you have male or female genitals, for example. And gender refers to your awareness about yourself. So technically, someone who is transsexual has physically crossed the sex boundary, either hormonally or surgically, while someone who's transgendered just isn't the gender they were assigned at birth, and no physical transformation has to take place in order for that to be a real and recognized thing. The thing is, the two don't have to be connected. And if you're talking about whether or not someone has crossed the sex boundary, I use the term boundary pretty loosely here because, we just had a whole video about how sex isn't actually binary. When you're talking about someone's sex, you're getting into pretty personal topics. What hormones someone has in their body or what their genitals look like is not your business. Not unless you're their partner or their doctor or someone who necessarily has a right to discuss the intimate details of their body with them. So while I'd say that transsexual falls under the trans umbrella, it's not something you ever need to discuss with someone outside of a medical conversation. And it's super rude, unless you're both close enough that you're comfortable discussing each other's genitals. Intersex is a biological category that sometimes gets put under the trans umbrella. Remember androgen insensitivity? That's the one that can wind up with a mix and match of internal and external sexual organs. That's a type of intersex in which your physical form is neither distinctly male nor distinctly female. People who are intersex used to be called hermaphrodites, but that term is misleading. In science, a hermaphrodite can produce the reproductive materials called gametes of either sex. But humans who are intersex can't produce both eggs and sperm. So scientifically speaking, they're not hermaphrodites. And, of course, because people like to be rude over someone not being normal, over time, the term hermaphrodite became derogatory. So now we don't use it because it's both rude and inaccurate. People who are intersex may consider themselves trans, or they may have a predominant set of genitals and consider themselves cis, or they may consider themselves non-binary. Speaking of which, cis men, trans women, cis women, either way, they're all identifying as men and women. But not everyone identifies as a man or a woman, and not everyone identifies the same way all the time. People who are gender fluid feel like their gender shifts around. Some days they feel more like a man, some days they feel more like a woman, and the switch can happen very suddenly in their own minds. Gender queer is a term that there's a little bit of controversy over. Queer was a derogatory term for gay for a very long time, so the older members of the LGBT community tend to shy away from it. The younger parts of the community, however, have chosen to reclaim it, and today queer is frequently used as an umbrella term for a huge segment of the LGBTQ community. In this particular context, genderqueer is synonymous with non-binary, and it simply means someone doesn't identify as a set gender. Some people who identify as genderqueer don't consider themselves to be part of the trans community because they don't think they've crossed a gender divide. They think they've left gender behind completely. As always, my rule is, when in doubt, let individuals define themselves. There is speculation in the scientific community that there might be a biological reason why some people are trans. Some small studies seem to show differences in brain structure that might indicate that there's a neurological difference in the trans community. In addition, we've known for a long time that during key points in pregnancy, fetuses are exposed to different concentrated levels of hormones. The chemical makeup of these hormonal baths is supposed to be based on the sex of the fetus, and exposure to the hormone bath switches on and off certain gene structures. Sometimes, however, these hormonal baths are atypical, either in duration or level or chemical composition, and we're not certain what effect that has on the developing fetus. There are theories that these altered hormone baths might be what causes someone to be homosexual or to be trans. Right. So, anyway, it's interesting that there might be a biological reason, and purely for science sake, it would be great if the research continued. There are those in the trans community, however, who are concerned that data like this might be used to put barriers in place for trans folks who are seeking treatment. There shouldn't be a litmus test you have to pass to be recognized as who you know yourself to be. So, while the research is cool, keep in mind that there's so much more that we have to discover about our bodies. And in the meantime, people have the right to define themselves as they wish. Okay, so now that we've covered all this, what do you need to know? If you yourself are trans or are wondering if you might be trans, there's probably a lot more you need to know. If you're questioning, I'm going to recommend the Gender Quest Workbook. It's a very open-ended guide that can help you figure out some basic questions about your own gender. If you're trans and looking for resources, the first place I'm going to point you is transstudent.org. They have a resources page that has multiple listings for educational resources, service resources, medical resources, legal resources, and informational resources. It's a dull-looking page, but it has a comprehensive list of all of the most relevant trans support pages. If you're cis, you have the easiest bottom line. Know that trans people exist, and that that's cool. Speak to them with courtesy and respect, using the pronouns and terminology that they prefer. And don't ask about their junk. In other words, treat them like people. What a novel idea. Any questions? Hit me up in the comments on Twitter or on Facebook. See you all next time, and until then, keep educating yourself.